The room was full and she was alone in it. She sat perfectly still in the middle of all of it, hands folded, back straight, like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible in rooms that had already decided they didn't want her. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know her story. I just knew that look on her face, and I knew I wasn't going to stand at that wall and pretend I hadn't seen it. Hi, my name is Cole Briggs. I'm 35 years old, and I live in Savannah, Georgia, a city that takes its history seriously and its social events even more seriously. I work in historic restoration, not the kind where you slap a coat of paint on an old wall and call it preserved. The real kind. Structural assessments, foundation work, the slow, careful business of keeping old things standing when the world keeps trying to tear them down. I've been doing it for 11 years and I'm good at it. I'm less good at charity galas. My company had been contracted to assess 3 buildings the Ashby Preservation Foundation owned on the east side of the historic district. My senior partner Richard Holt had arranged our attendance at the foundation's annual gala as a show of good faith. Richard was the kind of man who believed showing up in the right room at the right time was worth more than any actual work you did. I disagreed. I showed up anyway. The Whitfield Hotel ballroom was everything Savannah society thought it should be. High ceilings, candlelight, women in dresses that cost more than my monthly rent. The kind of room where everyone was performing a version of themselves they'd rehearsed in the mirror. I got a glass of water and found the wall nearest the exit. That was my plan. Stay 1 hour, be seen, leave. That was when I saw her. She was sitting alone at a round table near the center of the room. Ivory dress, simple cut. The kind of elegant that doesn't need to announce itself. Dark hair swept back. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back very straight, the posture of someone who had learned that stillness could look like confidence even when it wasn't. No one was sitting with her. No one was walking over. People passed her table, glanced, and looked away. A woman near me leaned toward her companion and said in a low voice, "Still comes to these things after everything." I didn't know what everything meant, but I recognized the look on her face. I'd seen it in old buildings sometimes, the ones that had been through fires or floods and were still standing, not because nothing had happened to them, but because they had absorbed it and held. She wasn't performing composure. She had learned it the hard way. Then I heard Richard. He was at the bar with 2 other men from the firm, already on his 3rd bourbon, his voice carrying the way it always did when he wanted an audience. He spotted me, lifted his glass. "Cole," he pointed across the room, "you spend all day trying to save things that are past saving. There's one right there. That's Vivian Ashby." A few people nearby glanced over. Richard's companion laughed, low and brief but sharp. "The famous fallen heiress." Richard smiled. "Her father built half the historic district. Then his partner stole everything and the whole family came apart. She's been trying to rebuild the foundation ever since." He paused, making sure his voice carried. "Doesn't seem to be working. Half the board won't return her calls. But she keeps showing up." I looked at her again. She hadn't moved. Her fingers had tightened slightly on the edge of the table. I caught it from across the room, but her face stayed still. She was listening. She had heard every word. And she was sitting there absorbing it, the way she had clearly absorbed 100 versions of it before, because leaving would have meant they won. I set my water glass down on the nearest tray. I crossed the room. I didn't have a speech prepared. I didn't have a plan. I just walked to her table, pulled out the chair directly beside her, not across from her, beside her, set it down close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, and sat down. I turned and looked directly at Richard. "If it's worth saying," I said, my voice even carrying clearly, "say it to the room, not the bar." The laughter died. Richard's smile went stiff. I held his gaze for 1 more second, then turned away. Vivian was looking at me. Her eyes were dark and steady and very tired. The tiredness that doesn't come from one bad night but from years of them. I saw something in her expression shift. Not gratitude exactly, more like the particular surprise of someone who had stopped expecting people to act differently and had just watched one do it anyway. I didn't say anything, I just sat there. And for the first time since I'd walked into that ballroom, I felt like I was in the right place. The first few minutes between us were quiet in the way that only happens when two people have both decided the surrounding noise doesn't deserve their attention. I picked up the menu that had been left at the table and looked at it without reading it. "The crab bisque is always oversalted at these things," I said. Vivian glanced at me. "It is." A pause. "How would you know?" "I've been to 3 of these in the last year. They use the same caterer." She looked at me for a moment. "You didn't want to be here tonight." "No," I said. "Did you?" Something passed across her face. "I never want to be here," she said quietly. "But the foundation needs visibility, so I come." I nodded. I didn't push. I'd learned a long time ago that the best way to get a building to reveal its problems was to stop looking for them and just be present. She spoke again after a moment, not like she'd decided to, more like the words had been waiting long enough. "My father built the Ashby Foundation 30 years ago," she said. "Historic preservation, restoration grants, community advocacy. He believed that a city's history was worth protecting even when it wasn't profitable." She traced the rim of her water glass. "His partner didn't agree. Not after he found a buyer for 3 of the buildings the foundation owned. He forged my father's signature on the transfer documents and moved the money before anyone caught it." "Your father didn't recover," I said, not a question. "He had a stroke 8 months after it came out," she said. "He died before the case was fully resolved." She was quiet for a moment. "I was 24. My mother had already been sick for 2 years. I spent the next year managing her care and the lawyers and the creditors and watching people who had sat at my father's table suddenly find reasons not to return phone calls. I stayed quiet. She didn't need me to fill it. I worked in one of the hotels the foundation used to partner with," she continued. "Housekeeping, then front desk, then events. I learned every part of it from the ground up." She looked at me directly. "I rebuilt the foundation 4 years ago. New board, new charter, new funding. We have 11 active restoration projects in the historic district right now." Her voice was steady and clear, but the people who watched it fall apart never quite forgave me for putting it back together. "I think it inconveniences them." I looked at her. The ballroom moved around us. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses, but it felt very far away. "I've worked on buildings people said were past saving," I said. "Usually the ones they're most wrong about are the ones that had the best original construction. The foundation is solid even when everything on top of it isn't." Vivian studied me. "You're talking about buildings." "Yes," I said. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. Something quieter. The beginning of one, maybe, or the memory of one. I didn't push it. I just sat there beside her while the room continued its performance and neither of us participated in it. Richard came back. I heard him before I saw him. The particular heavy tread of a man who had convinced himself he still held the room. He stopped at our table with his bourbon and his smile, and the specific energy of someone who had decided the previous encounter needed a conclusion. "Well," he said, looking between us. "Quite the pair," he addressed Vivian directly. "I have to say, Miss Ashby, I admire the persistence. Most people in your position would have moved on by now, found something quieter to do." Vivian didn't speak. She looked at him the way you look at a crack in a wall, noting it, assessing it, deciding whether it's structural. Richard turned to me. "Cole, I hope you understand the optics here. Our firm has a reputation to maintain. Being seen with—" "Richard!" My voice was quiet. He stopped. "I'm going to ask you to finish that sentence very carefully." Something in my tone got through. He recalibrated, smiled. "I just mean—" "I know what you mean," I said. "That's the problem." I stood up, not quickly, not with anger, just stood and looked at him with the particular patience I used when a client was about to make a very expensive mistake. "The Ashby Foundation approached our firm because they want the assessment done right. Not fast, not cheap, right. That's what I do. I looked at him steadily. What you just did in this room twice tonight is not what I do, and it's not what our firm does. Richard's jaw tightened. He looked around at the tables nearby. A few faces turned carefully away, a few others watching with a quiet attention they were pretending not to have. He left without another word. I sat back down. Vivian was watching me. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. He's your senior partner. I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You just ended your relationship with him, probably." "Probably," I said. She looked at me for a long time. "Why?" I thought about the buildings I'd spent 11 years working on. The ones that had been stripped and sold and neglected and were still standing, stubbornly, because the people who built them had done it right. I thought about what it meant to just show up and do the work, without needing anyone to notice. Because I didn't want to be the kind of man who looks back on a night like this and can't explain himself, I said. Vivian held my gaze. Something in her face, the last piece of guard she'd been keeping up all night, quietly came down. The evening ended differently than it began. A man named George Whitfield, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself, came to the table and addressed Vivian as the director of the foundation. He needed her in the main hall. There were board members waiting. She stood. She smoothed her dress, the same careful gesture I'd noticed when I first sat down, and turned to George. "Pull the full contractor list for tonight," she said, "and flag the assessment agreement with Holt and Briggs for review." George nodded. Then she turned to me. She didn't say thank you. She just looked at me the way she'd looked at the room when she decided she wasn't going to leave it, like she was filing something away carefully. "Cole Briggs," she said. Not a greeting, more like confirmation. I nodded. She walked toward the main hall. I stayed at the table for a while after that. The ballroom had gone back to its usual noise, though quieter in certain corners and more careful. I finished my water, then I left. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the way she'd said my name. Not like a thank you, like the beginning of something she hadn't decided the shape of yet. The morning after the gala, I sat in my truck outside my office building for 20 minutes before going in. I kept thinking about the way she'd said my name. Not like she was filing it away, like she was testing how it sounded. Richard was already at his desk when I arrived. He didn't say anything about the night before. He didn't have to. The way he looked at me when I walked past his office door said everything. I sat down at my own desk and pulled up the Ashby Foundation assessment files and started reading from the beginning. I spent the rest of the week doing what I always did, going into buildings, reading what they were telling me, making notes. The 3 Ashby properties on the east side were in better shape than I'd expected from the exterior. Good original construction, some deferred maintenance, nothing that couldn't be addressed with the right approach and the right timeline. I wrote my preliminary report carefully. Not because I was trying to impress anyone, because the work deserved to be done right. I filed it with George Whitfield's office on a Friday afternoon. I didn't send a copy to Richard. I didn't think about whether that was a problem. I just drove home and made dinner and went to bed. 3 days later, I got the call. The call came 3 weeks later, not from George, from Vivian directly. Her voice on the phone was the same as it had been in the ballroom, measured, precise, not wasting words. She wanted to meet. Her office Tuesday morning, 10 o'clock. She had a project she wanted to discuss. I showed up in the only button-down I owned that didn't have plaster dust on it. Her office was on the 4th floor of the Ashby building, one of the properties the foundation had reclaimed, with tall windows that looked out over the river and the old cotton warehouses below. She was already at her desk when I arrived. No assistant, no preamble. She slid a folder across the desk. On the cover, The Hearth Project. Inside were photographs, 12 buildings scattered across Savannah's east side, all of them historic, all of them abandoned. Some were shells. Some were structurally sound but completely neglected. Each one had a proposal attached. Full restoration, then conversion to permanent affordable housing for families displaced by recent demolitions in the downtown corridor. The foundation would hold the properties. The families would hold the leases. Long-term, community-anchored, built to last. I need someone to lead the technical assessments, Vivian said. Not someone who knows how to present in a boardroom. Someone who can walk into a building and know within 20 minutes whether it's worth saving and what it will take. She looked at me directly. Someone I trust to be honest when the answer is no. I looked at the photographs. The buildings were in worse shape than I usually worked with. 2 of them had serious foundation issues visible even in the photos. One had a collapsed interior wall. But the bones on most of them, the original construction, the brick, the framing, were evident even through the decay. The kind of thing most people missed because they were looking at what was broken instead of what had held. I'm not a project director, I said. I assess structures. I don't run timelines or manage contractors. She leaned back slightly. You assessed the room at the Whitfield and managed a situation most people would have walked away from, she said. In about 4 minutes. That's the same skill set. I looked at the folder again, then at her. I need to think about it. Take 2 days, she said. I took 3. On the 3rd morning I called her back and said yes. The months that followed were the fullest I'd had in years. We started with the building on Drayton Street, a 2-story Greek revival that had been sitting empty since a fire gutted the top floor in 2019. The foundation was intact. The damage was real but containable. I spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but assessment, every wall, every beam, every inch of the original structure. Vivian came on the 4th day. She showed up at 7 in the morning in work clothes with 2 cups of coffee and a set of the original architectural drawings she'd found in the foundation's archive. I hadn't asked her to find them, she'd found them anyway. We stood in the gutted 2nd floor with the drawings spread across a sawhorse and the morning light coming through the open window frames, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Like the work mattered beyond the work. Like I was standing somewhere real. She came back on the 8th day and the 11th. She didn't hover, she worked. She'd pull up chair specs, track material sourcing, field calls from the board so I didn't have to. When I found a problem she hadn't anticipated, she didn't deflect. She sat with the new information, asked the right questions, and adjusted. I started noticing small things. The way she always brought 2 coffees without asking. She'd figured out within the first week how I took it, and she never made a thing of it. The way she listened when I explained something structural, not waiting for the bottom line, actually listening, tracking the detail. The way she sometimes stood very still at the window of whatever building we were in, looking out at the street, and I couldn't tell if she was thinking about the project or something older. I noticed the way she held a pencil when she was making notes, pressing harder than necessary, like the act of writing something down was a form of certainty. I noticed that she always apologized when she called after 7 in the evening, even though I was always awake and always picked up. And that after about the 6th time she stopped apologizing, and I was glad. I noticed that when something went wrong on a site, and things always went wrong on restoration sites, it was the nature of the work. She didn't panic and she didn't deflect. She got very still and asked very precise questions, and then said, "Okay, what do we do first?" every time. The same 4 words. Like the problem itself didn't frighten her. Only the idea of not having a plan. I noticed the afternoon she arrived at the Drayton Street site and stood in the doorway of the finished front room for a long time without saying anything. The floors were done, the original plaster repaired, the windows restored. The light was coming through the way it would have come through 130 years ago when someone first built it. She stood in the doorway and I watched her face and I saw the exact moment she let herself feel it. The whole weight of what we were doing, what it meant, what her father would have thought. She didn't cry, she just stood there and breathed and let it be real. I never asked. I just handed her the next set of drawings and let the work be the work. But I noticed every time, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, I stopped pretending to myself that I was just doing a job. The work on the Drayton Street building took longer than the original timeline because I kept finding things. Not problems, exactly. More like conversations the building was having with me once I started listening properly. The original plaster walls had been covered with drywall in the 70s. When I pulled a section to check the framing, I found the original surface underneath, intact, horsehair plaster, nearly perfect. I called Vivian from the second floor. "Come look at this when you can," I said. She was there in 40 minutes. She stood in the half-demolished room and looked at the exposed section of original wall and didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "Can we save it?" "Most of it," I said. "It'll take longer, cost more." "Save it," she said. She didn't ask for a revised timeline. She didn't ask for a budget breakdown. She just said save it, and walked back down to her car, and I stood in the room for a moment after she left and understood something about how she operated. She didn't cut corners on things that deserved to be done right. She never had. She never had. The people who had described her as fallen, as diminished, as past saving, they had been reading the surface. They had not looked at the original construction underneath. The second building on the list was the Colleton House, a federal-style townhouse on Jones Street that had been used as a storage facility for 20 years before the foundation acquired it. The interior had been completely gutted by the previous owners. What remained was the shell. 4 walls, original heart pine floors under layers of commercial linoleum, a staircase that had somehow survived intact. We were doing the third-floor assessment on a Wednesday afternoon when Vivian found the room. It was small, a servant's room probably, tucked behind the main bedroom, and someone had papered the walls in a pattern of small blue flowers that was almost entirely intact, faded, water-stained in one corner. But there, 140 years old, still holding, Vivian stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time without speaking. I stood behind her in the hallway, holding my assessment clipboard, and I watched her face. "My mother used to have wallpaper like this," she said quietly, "in her dressing room. Blue flowers, different pattern, but the same feeling." She paused. "She died while I was in the middle of the foundation's first lawsuit. I didn't make it back in time." I didn't say anything. She wasn't asking me to. She stood in the doorway of the little room with the blue flower wallpaper, and she let herself feel whatever she needed to feel, and I stayed in the hallway and gave her the space to do it. After a while, she turned around. Her eyes were bright, but she didn't cry. "We keep the wallpaper," she said. "Whatever it takes." "Whatever it takes," I said. That was the first time I understood that what she was building wasn't just housing. It was something she owed to everyone who had held on when there was nothing easy about holding on, including herself. There was a morning in February I keep coming back to. We were at the 8th building on the list, a Victorian row house on Tatnall Street with good bones and very bad luck. The previous owner had tried to renovate it twice and abandoned the project both times, leaving the interior half-finished. Half-finished means half the problems are hidden and the other half look worse than they are. I was on the 3rd floor when I heard Vivian come in downstairs. I knew her footstep by then, the particular cadence of it, the way she always paused at the bottom of the staircase before she came up. I didn't call down, I just waited. She appeared in the doorway with coffee. She looked at the exposed framing where I'd pulled back a section of later drywall and set the coffee on the windowsill beside me. "Is it good?" she said. "Better than I thought," I said. "The original framing is intact. Someone knew what they were doing when they built this." She nodded. She was standing close. The room was small, and we'd both gotten used to working in close quarters without making anything of it. Then she said, without looking at me, "I've been offered a position, a consultancy in Charleston. Historic preservation oversight for the city. It would be significant work." I kept my hands on the framing. I kept my voice even. "When did you find out?" "Last week." A pause. "I haven't answered yet." I looked at the original timber in front of me, at the way someone 150 years ago had fitted it with a precision that had kept the building standing through everything. The good original work always held, even when everything on top of it didn't. "What do you want to do?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. Then I turned and looked at her. She was already looking at me, not the careful assessing look, something more open, something that had been building for months and had just decided it was done waiting. "I want to finish what we started here," she said. Her voice was quiet and very certain. "All 17 buildings, every one of them." She stopped. I waited. "Ask me again when we hand over the last key," she said. She went back downstairs. I stood in the third-floor room with the morning light coming through the restored window and the feeling of a question that had just been given a very specific answer. I turned back to the work, but I was smiling. Richard Holt left the firm in November. He didn't announce it dramatically. He simply stopped coming in, then sent a letter, then was gone. The two junior partners asked me if I wanted his position. I said I'd think about it. I was thinking about other things. The Hearth project had grown. What had started as 12 buildings was now 17, with 3 completed and families in residence. The first handover had been in October. A woman named Darlene Presley and her 2 teenage sons, who had been living in a single room at her sister's house for 8 months after their building was demolished for a parking structure. Vivian and I stood on the porch of the Drayton Street house while Darlene walked through the front door for the first time with the keys in her hand. She stopped in the middle of the living room and turned a slow circle, and then she sat down on the floor and put her face in her hands. Her sons stood on either side of her, not quite knowing what to do, until the older one sat down beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. I looked at Vivian. She was watching the 3 of them with her arms crossed and her jaw set in the way it got when she was trying to hold something in. I looked away, gave her a moment. When I looked back, she was looking at me. Her eyes were red. "You okay?" I said, quiet, just for her. She nodded. She didn't look away. "I was thinking about the first time I handed my father the keys to a building the foundation had saved," she said. "I was 17. He let me do it," he said. "Remember this. This is why we do it." I didn't say anything. We stood on the porch together while Darlene's sons helped their mother up from the floor, and the afternoon light moved across the restored facade of the building we had brought back. At some point, without either of us deciding to, we were standing close enough that our arms touched. She didn't move away. Neither did I. There was an evening in October, 2 weeks before the first Hearth project handover, when I stayed late at the Colleton house doing the final structural sign-off. Most of the work was done. The building was quiet, the way buildings get when the work is finished and they're waiting to be inhabited again. I was on the 2nd floor checking the last window seals when I heard the front door. Vivian came up the stairs with 2 coffees. She handed me one without saying anything and stood at the window looking out at Jones Street. The evening light was coming through at a low angle, October light in Savannah, warm and going golden. She looked at the street for a long time without speaking. I worked. Neither of us felt the need to fill the space. After a while she said, "When I was 17, my father brought me to a building the foundation had just finished restoring. An old warehouse on Bay Street that he'd turned into artists' studios. He gave me the key and told me to open it." She paused. I asked him why me. He said, "Because you're going to do this after I'm gone, and I want you to remember what it feels like the first time." I stopped working. I looked at her. She was still watching the street, her profile in the October light, the straight back, the careful stillness, but something different in it now. Not performance, just her. "I forgot for a long time," she said quietly. "After he died, after everything, I forgot what it felt like to open a door and know that something good was waiting on the other side." I set my clipboard down on the windowsill. "Do you remember now?" I asked. She turned from the window and looked at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The building was very quiet around us. The particular quiet of a restored place, settled and whole and itself again. "Getting there," she said. We stood at the window together while the evening finished going down over Jones Street. At some point our shoulders touched. Neither of us moved away. It was a Tuesday in December when she said it. We were the last ones left in the Colleton house. The contractors had gone for the day. The building was nearly finished, the floors gleaming and the blue flower wallpaper carefully preserved behind new glass in the small 3rd-floor room. We were doing a final walkthrough, just the 2 of us, checking the snag list. We ended up in the main parlor on the 1st floor. The evening light was coming through the restored sash windows and long flat panels, the way it does in December in Savannah when the sun is low and everything turns briefly gold. Vivian stood near the center of the room with her clipboard, making notes. I was checking the window seals on the south wall, she said. Cole. I turned. She was looking at me, not at the clipboard, not at the room, at me. The same direct, steady look she'd had since the first night, except different now, less guarded, more decided. I waited. She didn't look away. That night at the Whitfield, she said, you moved your chair. I remember, I said. You just moved your chair, she said again, quieter. You didn't make a speech. You didn't announce anything. You just moved it right beside me and sat down. She paused. The gold light moved slowly across the floor between us. No one had done that before, she said. Not like that. Not without wanting something from it. I looked at her. The room was very quiet. The kind of quiet that old buildings have when they've been restored and the work is done and they're finally just themselves again. I didn't move the chair for you, I said. She held my gaze. I know, she said. You moved it because it was right. And that's why. She stopped. Started again. That's why I want you to know that the last 8 months have been the first time in a long time I've trusted someone without waiting for it to go wrong. I crossed the room, not quickly, just walked to where she was standing and stopped in front of her. Close. The clipboard was between us and I took it gently and set it on the windowsill. She looked up at me. I don't know how to do this, she said. I've been on my own for so long I've forgotten what it feels like to let someone. She stopped. You don't have to know how, I said. You just have to stay. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached up and put her hand against my jaw. Just rested it there, the lightest possible weight. And I put my hand over hers and we stayed like that in the gold light of the finished room, while the city moved outside, and in here everything was still. You moved more than that, she said quietly. You know that. I did know. I just hadn't said it yet. Yeah, I said. I know. I started keeping things at the Colleton house. A spare set of tools, an extra jacket, a thermos I refilled at the coffee shop 2 blocks away. I told myself it was practical. I was there most days. It made sense. Vivian started leaving things too. A folder of archive drawings she'd found. A reference book on federal-style restoration she thought I should read. One morning I arrived to find a handwritten note on top of my clipboard that said, "The east window seal on the 3rd floor is still drafty. Checked it at 6 a.m. V." I read the note twice. She'd been there at 6 in the morning and hadn't waited to tell me in person. She'd just left the note and gone. I fixed the window seal. I left a note on her folder that said, "Fixed. Also, the south-facing sash sticks in humidity. Will address Thursday. See." She left a note the next day that said, "Thursday works. Bring the good coffee." I thought about that note on the drive home, about how easy it had become, about how I'd spent 11 years working in other people's buildings, fixing other people's problems, going home to my own quiet apartment and telling myself that was enough, about how different everything felt now, not because anything had changed in the work, but because someone was leaving notes on my clipboard at 6 in the morning and it didn't feel strange. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. The Hearth Project completed its 17th building in March. The foundation held a small gathering. Nothing like the Whitfield Gala, nothing that tried too hard. Folding chairs in the courtyard of the Colleton house, neighbors and board members and the families who now lived in the buildings we'd restored. Someone brought food. Someone else brought a speaker that played old Savannah jazz at a volume that felt right. Vivian stood near the entrance of the Colleton house, and shook hands and thanked people and answered questions with the steady attention she gave everything. I watched from across the courtyard, not because I was keeping distance, because I liked watching her in a room where nobody was whispering about her, where she was just herself, entirely, without anyone's history of her competing with who she actually was. After a while she crossed to where I was standing. She didn't say anything. She just stood beside me and looked out at the courtyard, at the families, at the buildings, at the thing we'd built together one honest day at a time. Her hand found mine. She didn't look at me when she took it. She just held on, the way you hold something you've decided to keep. I thought about the night I walked across a ballroom and pulled a chair beside a woman who had already decided the evening was going to hurt. I thought about how I hadn't done it for her. I'd done it because I couldn't do anything else and still be the person I wanted to be. I thought about everything that had come from that one small movement. The buildings, the families, the Tuesday in December in the gold light. The jazz played softly. The courtyard was full of people who had been given a second chance at something solid. Vivian squeezed my hand once. I squeezed back. She still didn't look at me. She didn't need to. We both knew what we were looking at. Some things don't announce themselves. They just quietly become true while you're doing the work. And one day you look up and realize the thing you were trying to build. You're already standing inside it.